let's see. We have Sammy, age 9. Is racism just because of the color of their skin?
That's a really good question. And like we talked about before, no, it's not. Remember, it's about power and who holds power and who doesn't have power. And so African Americans, for instance, they come in lots of different skin tones, lots of different shades. So does the Latinx community, which I'm a part of. My skin tone is very different than my grandma's and very different than my great grandparents. And so, for example, my oldest son does not mind me sharing the story. He's very open about it, but I think it gives a good example. So all my children are African American. They all identify as African American. They don't really identify as biracial. They feel very connected to the African American community and culture, and that's how they identify. My oldest son, he is more my skin tone. He's very, very fair in his skin tone. And much different than his dad and different than his younger brother. His younger brother's skin tone is much darker and much closer to his dad's. So, however, when he was in middle school, he had a really, really bad year. There were some kids at school who were calling him racial slurs. They were calling him names that you never ever want to say. You can probably guess what they are. They're ones that you would be like, I would never say that to someone. But they said it to him. And it made him feel super, super unwelcome at school. And it made him feel really scared because some of those kids also hit him. And they wanted him to not feel welcome at their school. And they wanted him to not feel welcome at their school because he's Black and because he identifies as Black. And that was their reason why. And what's interesting is that his skin tone was very light. But because that there was a community that he was a part of, and that's how he identified, and that's how they saw him, and they did not want him to feel welcome there, that's how he was treated. And so he had to go to a lot of different grown-ups, and I had to go to a lot of different grown-ups, and it was hard for us to get help. And we even had to do this thing where we file a complaint with what's called the Office for Civil Rights, who come in and help us, and they did. They came in and helped us. Because remember what we talked about Title VI in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that he had the right to go to school and feel safe and feel welcomed. So when we talk about skin tone, that's very different than the culture and the racial identity that people have. Because people in each culture and people in each racial identity community come in lots of different skin tones. The Asian community, for example, oh my gosh, there's so many countries that are part of what's called the Southeast Asian and Asian community. Cambodia, Laotia, Hawaii, Polynesian community is part of that community, Japan, China, and even within those countries, you have people who belong to different communities just in that country. And they all have different amounts of what's called melanin in their skin. Melanin is what makes us darker or lighter. So more melanin, you're darker, less melanin, you're lighter. But that's not what your community identity and your culture is. So it's sometimes we think of racism as just being the color of people's skin, but it's so much more complex. But here's where that part is true. For African Americans in particular, what we know is the darker their skin tone, the more incidences of racial discrimination and harassment they experience as a whole. And we do know that. So that part of it, the color of someone's skin, it does play into it. Because if you have darker skin and you have other features that are very clearly African American, you can't put them away. You can't take them off. You can't stop being that. There you are. And so we do know that the color of people's skin does play into it, but we also know that with racism, it's so much bigger than that.
So now we have Dean, age 10. Do all cops treat African Americans worse, all people of color? And Elizabeth, age 11, has a similar question, which is, do Black police treat people the same as white police? I think I said that wrong. I think it
Big
was,
question.
do black police treat people the same as white people? That was her actual
Yeah.
question.
So
Sorry, I messed that up.
yeah, that's a really, really big question. I know you guys are hearing a lot about that right now. So it has a lot to do what we talked about earlier about power and systems of power in our country that deny Black and brown people access to the same things. But here's what I want us to all be really careful about when we use the word all, right? So remember we talked about before, all means everybody. Everybody has the right to feel safe and welcome, and everybody has the right to certain things. And we want to make sure that when we say all, that's what we're talking about. So when we say all police, we can't really say that because I don't know every single police officer in the country at all. I know some, and I've had different experiences. Some experiences have been really good. Some experiences have not been really good. And I'm going to be very honest about that. And that's why we have to be careful when we say all. Now, that being said, we have to look at the system, right? We talked about systems. We talked about that engine in the car. Police officers have certain training to respond a certain way to certain situations and to certain people. And what we know is that there's this thing called implicit bias. It's a big word, and you're like, you threw a big word at me. Implicit bias means that when we first look at somebody, we make a decision about immediately, within seconds. We don't even think about it. We don't even sometimes realize we're doing it. Some people don't do it unconsciously. We make a decision about what we think that person is about, what we think they did or didn't do, what we think they're about, just at first glance, right? That's called implicit bias. So what we know is that law enforcement, the conversations we're having now is that we have to have more training around that thing called implicit bias so that everybody is treated fairly, so that decisions and assumptions aren't made about people the first second that they're having an interaction. So it's not that all police are good or all police are bad, because all people in any group aren't all one thing. We know that. But what we do know is that the system isn't working. And we know that that particular profession and system needs some changes so that everybody feels like they're being treated fairly and everybody feels. Remember, we talked about school and how all kids have the right to go to school and feel welcome and safe. It's the same thing. We want to make sure that everybody feels welcome and everybody feels safe and everybody feels like they're being helped the same way. And we know that right now that's not happening. So we all want to be really careful when we say all, okay? If you hear yourself saying all, I want you to stop yourself, okay? And then I want you to rethink your question. And I want you to rethink your idea. Or if you're making an assumption about somebody, because we all do it. So we all have implicit bias, by the way. All of us have implicit bias. We all make assumptions. So it's really important that when we feel that word all coming out of our mouth, that we go, oh, hit the brakes. What's a different word we can use? And what's a different way that we can look at this? And how can we think about this differently? And that goes for grownups. So tell your parents, okay? Do you hear grownups saying all or all the time or always? You know, speak up and say, hey, mom, no, not all. And it gives grownups do it too. A lot.
I love it. Yeah.
Especially on Facebook.
Yes. Which you guys will learn hopefully in a few years and not now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, you're not old enough to be on Facebook, you guys.
no. The next question I think was answered in that, but I'll just read it really quick. Andrew, age 11, wanted to know, isn't it bad to say all police are bad? Just like, isn't it like how we're saying all protesters are bad? So that really was answered there, but I wanted to point out that that distinction was very smart of you to make. So we're going to move on to
yeah, and I want to add something
okay.
to that real quick though, because I had looked at that question, and something I want to remind you is, guess what? We can all, here's the time when I'm going to use the word all, because this is true. We can all get better at what we do. We can all get better about what we think, and we can all do better in learning more. So I'm an advocate for kids in school, but I'm not always knowing everything. And sometimes things that I thought I knew, I realized weren't true or weren't right. And then I do better and I learn better and I get better at my job. So just remember with something like that, that everybody has the potential and everybody who's in a really important job where they do things that impact other people, that we actually have the responsibility, I have the responsibility of being better at my job all the time. That's why your teachers do teacher work days.
Yes. Yeah. Grown-ups, we're all still learning. She's right. You don't stop at college. You keep learning.
Yes.
Alexis, age 12, says, what is segregation and do we still have it? And Chloe has a similar question, which is, isn't this like what they were talking about with boys' bathrooms and girls' bathrooms? I think that's a pretty recent topic. Yeah.
It is. You guys will actually probably talk about that some more when Gary comes on. But what we talked about, what segregation is when we talked about Jim Crow laws. But yes, we still have it, even though we don't have Jim Crow laws. We do still have segregation, and it's part of that system. We keep talking about that big system, that engine in the car. So an example that might make sense to you guys is look at who lives where in a city or a town, right? We often see that people of color in a community will live in one section of town, and often that section of town doesn't have a big grocery store or it doesn't have a bank. But the other section of town where you'll see lots of people who are predominantly white, they'll have a couple grocery stores and several banks. So that's a form of segregation. You've got one side of town where people have access to important things like grocery stores and banks, and another side of town where they only have access to some small markets and they have to go all the way to the other side of town to cash their check or to take money out of the bank or to talk to somebody at the bank. They can't just, walk around the corner. So that's a form of segregation. What people were talking about with bathrooms, that bathroom conversation is really actually about each person, and including kids at school, being able to choose the bathroom that matches the gender that they identify with. And so one of the solutions, which I kind of think is a really great solution, it makes sense to me, is that you just have a bathroom for everybody. Everybody just uses the bathroom. I mean, do you have different bathrooms at your house for boys or for girls? Like, no, we all use the same bathroom and we all wash our hands, wash them extra right now. And we all go to the bathroom and we all use the same stuff in the bathroom, right? So you notice when you go to Starbucks, for example, there's only one bathroom in Starbucks, right? And boys can use it and girls can use it, and people who use the pronoun they get to use it. And so I think that's a great solution. And so that's more of what that bathroom conversation was about. It wasn't so much about segregation. It's really just about access. And I know that Gary is going to have a lot more information about that because he's really, really knowledgeable. And that'll be a really good conversation.
So we're going to end with a couple questions about being an ally. So first one, Natalie, age 10, said, my mom told me to be a good ally, but I don't know what that means.
Okay, well, your mom's right. Being a good ally is pretty much a lot like being a good friend. And sometimes you have to be a good friend even to somebody you've never met before because you can see that they need you to step up for them, right? And so sometimes we call this too being an accomplice. So being an ally means you say important things that get the information out there that people need to have about what it means to do anti-racism work and to not be discriminatory and to be fair and about social justice and about civil rights. Being an accomplice, though, people talk about that. That means actually stepping up and walking up next to the person and saying, that's not okay, and you don't get to talk to that person that way, or you don't get to treat that person that way, or stepping up to that person and saying, hey, do you want to come with me? Let's go over here, and sort of getting them away from the person who's causing them harm, and doing that work, but here's what's important, because you guys are kids, okay? And this is a really important part, is that sometimes you want to be a good ally and you want to be a good accomplice and you want to help, but maybe you're feeling scared too. Maybe the other person who's not being kind is actually being really scary. And that's one of those times where being an ally and being an accomplice is getting a grown-up and getting some help, okay? Because it's important for everybody to be safe. So if you ever feel like something's happening that's not right, but you're also feeling really scared, you get a grown-up, okay? And if you go to a grown-up that doesn't come and help, Maybe they're busy, maybe they didn't hear you, or maybe who knows. You go get a different grown-up. And you keep going to grown-ups until you get the grown-up that comes to help you, okay? And if you still feel like you're having a hard time getting help, guess what? You can call me. My job is to come as an advocate and to help. That's my job. So you can always call me, and I promise you, if you call me, I'll always come help. But I know that there's lots of grown-ups at school who will help, and so you just got to keep going until you find one. But let's say you're not scared. Let's say you're feeling super brave, and you feel like this is just somebody saying mean things. That's not scary. You march right up there, even if you don't know that other kid. You march up there and you say, you don't get to say that in our school. And I'm not going to let you. And we're going to go get a grown-up right now. And you help get that kid who's experiencing there out of that situation, and you take them to a grown-up and you go get some help. That's what being a good ally is. That's what being a good accomplice is. And you keep asking for help loudly because you have a really strong voice and you can use your voice, and it's okay to be loud.
I love that answer. And Anna, age 11, says, sometimes it's hard when I see people of color. How do I know what words not to use to not be rude?
Yeah. So a lot of grown-ups ask this question too. They're like, I don't know whether to say African American or Black. And I don't know whether to say Latino or Hispanic or Chicano, or I don't know what words I'm supposed to use, right? So here's the answer to that question. Ask. Because lots of different people have lots of different preferences. So some people prefer to be called African American. My family, my children, they identify as Black. They say I'm Black. That's their preference, right? But some of our relatives don't. Some of our relatives are like, nope, I prefer to be called African American. I myself identify as Chicana or Latinx. I was born in the United States. My grandmother is Mexican, but my grandmother grew up in New Mexico and has always lived there generations back. So for us, we identify as what's called Chicano, which is mostly Mexicans who were born here in the United States. And there's a slight cultural difference. So if you ask me, that's what I'll tell you. So what I always say is, if you don't know, it's okay to ask. You can say to somebody, what do you prefer? Because I want to use what you prefer. Gary's going to talk about this, I'm sure, when he comes and he talks about LGBTQ community. We talk about this a lot with preferences, pronouns. We ask people, what are your preferred pronouns? He, she, they, them. What do you prefer? And then the important part is when somebody tells you their preference of their identity, that you honor it and that you use it. And here's a great one. If you use the wrong one, you say you're sorry. And then you use the right one. Because guess what? Everybody makes mistakes. Okay? And it's okay. But what's important is that we learn from our mistakes and we don't just keep doing them over and over and over again. One thing I want to talk about this is, you may hear grown-ups talk about being colorblind. Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. You'll hear that a lot. And so what I want to tell you and share with you is that actually that doesn't feel so great when you are a person of color. Because what the person is kind of saying to you, and they don't mean it this way and they don't understand that that's what they're saying, but it's important for them to learn, is I don't see part of who you are. So for me, being Muslim, being Chicana, being a woman, being a mother, those are all parts of who I am. And that has a lot to do with what I believe, how I do my life, the things that I like, the foods that I like, the music that I like to listen to, all of those things has to do a lot with what I believe. And so if somebody says, oh, Celeste, I'm colorblind, I don't see any of that. For me, that feels like, wow, you are not seeing a big part of who I am, and a big part of who I am that I'm really proud of. Being Chicana, having a Mexican grandmother who grew up in New Mexico, whose parents were there when New Mexico wasn't New Mexico, it was actually Mexico. That's I'm proud of that. I'm very, very proud of that. And I love sharing that. So I don't want anybody to be blind to that. And so it's important to see people who they are. It's important to ask questions and listen and understand and learn. You may learn some really cool stuff about their family. You may learn really cool things about things they believe, things you never thought of before. So if you don't know, just ask. And it's totally okay to ask. In fact, people will probably be like, wow, thanks for asking. Thanks for seeing me. Okay. It's not rude.
And we're down to the last two, but I think they're big ones. So Zachary, age 12, says, how do I know if I'm racist?
Yeah. So Zachary, I want to say to you that I'm really proud of you for asking this question, because I know a lot of grownups that need to ask this question. Okay. And you are really smart and really brave for asking this. It tells me that you're somebody who spends a lot of time looking at yourself and asking lots of questions and wondering if all the things you think or know are all that's out there. Okay. So we all need to do more of that. All of us. Okay. Because sometimes we're not good listeners. Remember we talked about that? Sometimes, especially grown-ups, not good listeners. So we got to ask ourselves, and these aren't questions where we stand in the middle of the street and we say, I'm going to ask myself these questions. These are things when we're sitting there by ourselves and we're thinking about who we are and who we want to be and how do we want to be better, that we ask ourselves. So we all need to ask ourselves questions like, do I have friends who are not like me? Do I have friends from different cultures, different races? Do I really know them? Or do I just play with them at school? Do I know about their culture? Do I know their family? Do I play at their house? Do they play at my house? What do I know? Those are a good start, because if you don't know anybody who's any different than you, then you're not going to learn anything. And you might think or know some things that could be racist just because you've never met anybody else, right? So that's important to get to know people. You should ask yourself questions about, what do you believe people have the right to have? And what do you believe about, how they get those things? Do you think it's their fault that they don't have those things? Or do you think maybe there's some stuff that prevents them from getting those things? Those are all good questions we have to ask ourselves. And a big thing is to go to school and to tell your teacher and to tell your principals, I want our school to do anti-racism work. I want us to learn how to be anti-racism. I want us to learn these things. Because guess what? There is curriculum, which is like whole programs that really smart people developed with materials and videos and different ways of teaching, that teach us all how to not be racist and how to be better people and to be more inclusive and to be more equitable. And those are things that you can learn in school. And I know for a fact that those are things our school district is working on developing and bringing into our schools. But you as kids have the power to ask for those things and say, I want to do that work and I want to learn that. And you should ask your teachers and ask your principals and ask your school counselors, because when they hear from kids that kids want that, then it makes it easier for us as grownups to help get you guys that. But we are working on it.
Really good
I know
advice.
I'm working on it.
Yeah. And you would be, because you're working with the schools. So last question, and it's another big one. Gabe, age 11, should I be protesting too?
You know what, Gabe? If you want to, then yes. But here's what I want you to know. There's lots of ways to protest. There's not just one, okay? And it's really important to remember we are in a viral pandemic. There is a virus called COVID-19 that I know you've all heard about. It's why you guys weren't in school and you're having to do school from home. And it's really serious. And this virus, it spreads through the little droplets that come out of our mouths when we talk. That's where we wear our masks, right? Why we wash our hands a lot. So that's why we're staying home. So if you and your family don't feel safe going to a protest, although just so you know, the protesters are out there wearing masks, okay? But they are taking a risk in COVID, and it's a risk they're willing to take. But some people can't take that risk. They have diabetes, or they have asthma, or they are just falling into a risk category where it would be very, very dangerous for them to get COVID. There's still ways to protest. So here's some things you can do. So ask your parents, where do we spend our money? Where do we shop? What stores do we go to? And then go look those stores up on the internet and find out, are those stores supporting Black Lives Matter? Are those stores doing anti-racism work? Are they as a company supporting that? And then you make a decision, do we want to spend our money with that store or not? That's a form of protest. Remember we talked about Rosa Parks and the bus boycott when they didn't give their money to the buses? That is a form of protest that you can do safely from your home. You can write letters to your state representatives. You can write letters to the governor. You can write letters to your Congress people, to your state representatives. Kids can write letters, and your parents can help you get the address on the computer. They can get you the address, and you can sit down and you can write them a letter and put a stamp on it, because believe it or not, letters in the mail with a stamp, they're pretty meaningful, okay? And write them a letter and tell them what you think. Just because you're not old enough to vote doesn't mean that they don't have a responsibility to you. They represent you and they have a responsibility to you. And just because you're not old enough to vote doesn't mean that they don't have a responsibility to you. And guess what? Someday, sooner than you know it, you are going to have the right to vote. Okay? So you can write letters to your representatives. You can make signs for the front of your house. You can have a garage sale and sell some toys and stuff that maybe you don't play with anymore, and you can donate that money to organizations that support Black lives. So there's lots of things that you can do that are forms of protest and support protesting that you can do safely from your home if you and your family don't feel that it's safe for you to go to a protest, okay? Your voice matters.
Well, thank you so much. We've been talking to Celeste Winders, who's been asking or answering our questions on racism, Black Lives Matter, protesting, all of the things that have been on the news recently. We touched on COVID for a second, and I want to remind you our first guest was Dr. Jerome Smith, who answers lots of questions about COVID-19 and coronavirus and all of those things. And then we also had Mayor Logan Harvey on, who talked about quarantining and when things open up in our town. Next up, we have Sarah from Sonoma Fire and Rescue, who's going to answer your questions about firestorms and fire season. What do firefighters do? And then Gary Saperstein is going to join us to talk about LGBTQ topics. So keep your questions coming. Have your parents find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Sonoma Kids Ask. And Celeste, if somebody needs to reach out to you for help, how can they find you?
So your parents can always find me on Facebook if they want. I'm there. But they can also email me at info@strategiceducationadvocacy.com. There's lots of ways to find me. I'm pretty easy to find.
Well, thank you for staying and answering extra questions, because I think it was all really good information. And I learned a lot, so I hope all the kids learned a lot too. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for asking good questions.
Yeah. Bye, guys.
Bye.